It's a pleasure to be here. I am, like Nancy said, the former executive director of VSA Florida. I worked with the organization for almost 20 years. VSA is part of an international organization that's housed through the Kennedy Center. There are about 35 states that are members of VSA and about 60 countries internationally. And this year is a celebration of the 40th anniversary of the ADA and the beginning of VSA. And so there'll be a lot of big celebrations in Washington, D.C. coming up this summer. Jean Kennedy Smith was our founder, was part of the Kennedy legacy, and she is still a very active member of the VSA family. And she'll be getting a number of awards in Washington this summer. She's a great, great lady. I had an opportunity to actually work with her and get to know her really well. Great stories that she can tell about the ins and outs of being a Kennedy. Well, thank you all for coming. I want to start this is going to be a conversation because I want you to ask me questions. I want to have discussions about what some of your issues might be in having people with disabilities become active participants in your organizations. So we're going to start with just some background about why it's financially important to include people with disabilities. Then we'll have our spokesperson from the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Association come in and talk a little bit about what some of their concerns might be. And then we'll go into some guest services, how to work specifically with people with disabilities. We'll do some marketing, we'll do some business plans, and just a whole lot of information. But again, this is just for us to have a conversation. So raise your hand or speak out, whatever you want to, if what I'm talking about is not clear. So access is a work in progress. I don't think we're ever fully going to be 100% accessible because there's always new things and new ways of doing things. My best suggestion for all of you is to just keep working at it and make it something that you look at and address frequently. So let's first look at arts and cultural organizations. Why do people come to your facility? Well, they could be, let's see, I have to figure out how to do this and still talk into the microphone. People attend cultural events because they specifically are coming there to attend the event or go to the opening or go to the show, or vacation or holiday is the next activity, work or business, and to visit friends or relatives or others. So cultural tourism is a big activity for you to engage those people who are coming into the community. So accessibility is really needed for about 10% of the population. It's a necessity for about 30 to 40%, but what we do for access is what we can do for everybody to make visits more enjoyable. So it's when we talk about doors with push buttons, it's not only for someone who uses a chair or might use crutches, but it's also for those of us who are carrying bags and bags and we can't pull the door open, things fall, or we've got children in strollers that we want to, get through. So access just makes life easier for everybody else. They say that about 41% of people in the United States have a disability, and their combined income is more than $1 trillion. So people with disabilities do not have low incomes. And there's about $220 billion in discretionary income. And you may always hear about people with disabilities needing special services or it's difficult for them to get jobs, and yes, that is true. But a great majority of individuals with disabilities gain that disability later on in life after they've gone to work or they've done, made their dollars and had their families or whatever. So that's where that big money picture comes in. So we've got pictures of people on the beach with the big chairs to enjoy going out to the beach just like everybody else. So they say that access is an environment where people of all abilities are felt welcome and wanted as customers and guests. Access is no longer a disability rights issue. It is an economic imperative. People will spend money to go to your facilities. So it's hard to talk about the statistics of numbers of people with disabilities. But the main thing is that when you go to an art venue, when you go to the theater or you go to a museum, you're usually not attending it by yourself. You're attending it with your coworkers, your family, your friends. So someone who has a disability is attending your facility, coming to your facility. They say the multiplier effect of people coming is 2.8 to 3.5 people. So if you exclude someone with a disability from visiting your facility because they can't get in, or they, have trouble hearing, or can't maneuver through an art exhibit, you're effectively losing between 3 and 4 people from coming into your facility and spending money with you. All right, there's a whole ton of statistics which I won't go over, but the numbers of people with disabilities are growing. We are in the baby boomer retirement age. Baby boomers, we need glasses, we don't walk as well as we used to, we don't hear as well as we used to, and we don't always acknowledge the fact that we have a disability. We just don't see as well as we used to, that's all, So a lot of this is what you will be dealing with as more and more of us have these different disabilities as we get older. So I'm not going to go over all these different statistics with you, but we're growing. The population is definitely growing. So as a disability review, we have people on the autism spectrum. We have a hearing loss population, a vision loss, mobility, and other disabilities. And we're going to go over some of that as we go on through the day, but I want to invite our individuals here with our hearing loss community. Yes, if you can, I'm told we have to talk in the microphones and just come up and sit at the desk up here and we'll just have a conversation. So I'd appreciate if you'd each introduce yourselves.
Okay. I'm Rick Kotler. I'm the Executive Director for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services of the Treasure Coast.
And I'm Susie Hutchison. I am the CEO of Helping People Succeed.
I'm Frances Mason from Helping People Succeed Community Relations Director.
So I ask people whenever I do these trainings to bring in people with different disabilities to talk to the arts organizations about what some of their concerns might be or what some of their really aha moments might be when participating in going to the theater or being on stage or going to an art museum. So if we'd like to start, we'll start down at the end over there. Just a few minutes of what it's been, what your observations have been.
The observation for when we have group, we have a day program, when we go to different places, it could be accessibility for doors. You have to have someone holding the door for you. Or if it's a trail, the trail will not necessarily be accessible for wheelchair or walker. These is somewhat most often we access difficulties the participant do live through, different exhibit we go through Martin County, maximum,
So is it more trouble getting into the facility or once you're inside, enjoying what's there, or both?
Accessibility to go inside for some of the older building we tour, and also when you inside, sometime with a walker, narrow, hallway could be difficult also to maneuver.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll take it from a little different perspective for our organization. We serve primarily people that have more significant disabilities, intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, autism, and people who have some mobility limitations. And we do our best to go out as often as possible to visit as many places as possible. Our goal is to help everybody feel like they're a part of the community, not apart from the community. And so we do go to a variety of places. Here's the good news: we're always welcomed. This is a very tight-knit community, and in both Martin and St. Lucie County, I would say we are always welcomed. We also are very careful that we don't go out in large groups, because we don't want to have people staring at us and wondering what we're doing. We go in small groups so we fit into the general flow of wherever we're going. We also have an arts program ourselves. We have what's called Design Success, and we actually have folks with significant disabilities who make lovely pieces of art, pieces that you would be proud to have in your home. Some of our artwork is hanging in a woman's home in Jupiter Island. So we do bring people in to see what we do, as well as go out into the community. Accessibility can always be an issue. When you talk to people about it, it's always about cost, old buildings, etc. And again, we do our best to go as many places as we can. And we're developing some budding artists and some budding folks who do well with ceramics, and the self-esteem that people gain when they go not only and visit places but also create their own art is just beyond any, you can't even describe how incredible it is for that person.
So my question to you, when you say that the arts institutions in this area are welcoming, are they welcoming like coming into this room today? That they say, welcome, 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 we're so glad you're here, and...
I would say it's not quite that bad, but it's
Good.
not quite that bad. We'll talk to Nancy later about, but it's not that, it's heavy doors. I mean, I think that the newer buildings obviously are very conscious of accessibility kinds of things, and we've had a gentleman in our community who has made the county commission very aware when there are obstacles. So I think that there is at least an acknowledgement and a recognition of how important it is. I think it's always an issue of how much does it cost to do this. So I think once we get in, I mean, it's, if you have somebody with so many of the folks that we work with do have an awkward gait, or their balance isn't always perfect when they're walking, let's say on a trail. And so it can be, and yet at the same time, you don't necessarily want to make everything a paved area. So it's kind of a give and take, I feel, for people with disabilities as well as without. Can I tell you one more thing? Okay. One of the things that I'm very excited about in this community is at Kiwanis Park downtown, which is a public park in Stewart. We are building a barrier-free park connected with that park. So it's a park where all people can play together. We have what's called a sway fund that you can tie down wheelchairs, and then the benches in the back, so people that only can use a wheelchair can swing. And the great piece is that, let's say even you're a parent with a disability, I was talking to Rebecca, you maybe have some issue with mobility. You can take your children to play on that part of the playground, instead of maybe where there's sand and all kinds of things there. So it's the only park in our area that has a park both for typical children and children with special needs, but there's a crossover. Anybody can play on our park.
That's
and
terrific.
We're building that this weekend. So if you're still here and have nothing to do, come and have fun with us on Saturday and Sunday. But that, I think, from a standpoint of there's art with it. There's a lot of tactile stuff for folks with autism, and we're going to be creating art in our park, not to steal anybody else's thunder, because there is art in the park, right, Nancy? But anyhow, but we're going to be doing everything we can to encourage artistic ability. We're going to have an area for reading, we're going to have an area for art, etc.
That's terrific.
We're excited. I'm excited.
And I liked your comment that it's our park. It's not just one group of people's park, it's everybody's park.
We all know that if children start playing together at an early age, they can walk up to the kid and say, "Why are you in a wheelchair?" And the kid says, "Because I can't walk." And, okay, fine, let's play. The older you get, the harder it is to just walk up and say, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" you know?
I've been hearing that for
I-
years.
Have you come up with a good answer?
No.
So anyhow, I don't mean to talk on and on, but I'm very excited about that fact that everybody can play together.
That's terrific. Thank
So,
you.
Thank you.
Okay. I represent the group that doesn't need physical assistance. But mine is one size does not fit all. So let me explain. We have our deaf population and we have a hard of hearing population. The deaf population normally uses manual interpretation, whether it's a sign language interpreter like Evelyn, or it's an oral interpreter. If someone is a speech reader, then an oral interpreter actually sits in front of that person and repeats everything that's being said so that they can read their lips. That's one group. The other group, which is the hard of hearing group, needs amplification. It can be accomplished by, if you listen to the Hearing Loss Association, which is their major consumer group, they like the loop system where you put literally run a wire around the room and run it to a transmitter, and the actual sound that is transmitted through the microphone goes directly to the person's hearing aid. The two problems with that is the hearing aid has to have a telecoil switch so that they can turn it on. And the other part is 1 out of 5 people has hearing aids that needs them. So you're only getting 20% of a limited population. The other one is to provide amplification either in an FM system or a infrared system. That requires headsets and providing headsets, but it's very adequate. The nice thing about that, and most venues do offer that, is because people who need it that don't maybe not have hearing aids, etc., so you're reaching a larger group of the population, they can go get them and listen to what's going on stage. The thing is, everything has to be mic'd. Everything on the stage has to be mic'd. So that's our problem, and it's always an issue, no matter where you go. Some things do not lend themselves well to sign language interpretation. There are art venues that just are not going to work. No, I'm not a big opera fan, but you're not going to have a sign language interpreter doing opera. Simply because, well, understanding what an interpreter does not translate word for word for word. An interpreter actually interprets what's being said in the English language and puts it into sign language, which is a totally different animal. It's not a translator. So anything that is going to require a direct one-on-one word correlation may or may not work with a sign language interpreter. However, like when Burt Reynolds was at the Lyric Theater and was doing a one-man show, that would be perfect for a sign language interpreter because they could get the gist of what's going on. There are certain music venues that work for deaf people, believe it or not. In any case, when you have when you're trying to attract a deaf group to come, you have to give them front row seating. You have to give them an interpreter close by. If it is music, and we have the kids from Florida School for Deaf and Blind, they have a dance troupe that come down. The deaf gather around the stage. They literally put a speaker face down on the stage so that they can feel the vibration and see what's going on. So don't rule anything out, but keep in mind some things just are not going to lend themselves well to it. And finally, let me give a plug to the county. I've worked closely with Bob Steiner, who's the ADA coordinator for Martin County, and their goal is to make this county 100% ADA compliant. And this is undoubtedly the most compliant county in the state of Florida today. No doubt about it.
I was just going to ask how often you receive calls from Sunrise Theater, Lyric Theater, Starstruck.
We got them,
Has that
we have gotten them in the past. Most people now are pretty clued in on what needs to be provided. We'll get occasionally call, should we loop this? And I basically tell them, yeah, but it's only going to reach a limited population. I still think that providing amplification in headsets is a better alternative.
Any other questions? Well, I have some. First of all, would you talk about, for visual arts organizations, the positioning of an interpreter, or when people are speaking and they're interpreting, what's the protocol for that?
It's going to depend on how many people are in the conversation. In this situation, there's only 3 of us, so she can stand off to the side and literally would point to who's ever speaking, and the deaf individual would know who's being interpreted for. If it's a large group, it may require 2 and 3 interpreters, an interpreter to cover this area, one to cover this area, one to cover this area. It gets a little confusing, but our deaf population is very clued in for it, and they're used to it, so it's not a problem. It's not as much of a problem for them as it looked like it would be for us.
So I'm using a microphone to talk to you all today. And if I have someone who is a lip reader, what do I do with the microphone while I'm talking? And if I'm talking into the microphone, can they see my lips?
Okay. First of all, a lip reader is not going to be able to see your lips from this far.
Okay.
I mean, that's not even a problem. Lip reading, the best lip readers in the world are only going to get 30% of what's being said, because that's how much actually shows up on your face. But with an oral interpreter, they can get almost the whole message. And an oral interpreter actually sits in front of them this close and will repeat everything that you would be saying. And they are trained to use certain facial expressions and lip movements to relay certain sounds. And so that person with that interpreter can get a whole lot more than if they were a lip reader and even sitting beside you, they'd only get 30%.
So does that mean that the person speaking needs to speak slower and pause more?
No, you need to speak in a normal cadence, for lack of a better word. If you speak too slow, then it gets confusing for the interpreters and the person that is trying to get the information. If you speak too fast, the interpreter will tell you to slow down.
Okay. What about open captioning and closed captioning?
Captioning is great for movies and things like that, particularly at the theater, at the Regal theaters, right up here at the mall. If you go in and you ask for the caption glasses, and Regal Theaters is the only one that has it, they're like 3D glasses that you put on, you wear a lanyard, and actually it puts the captioning on the glasses so that wherever you look on the screen, the captioning goes with you. And the captioning's not at the bottom, so it's not disturbing or distracting to people who don't need it. There is CART, which is real-time captioning. That is exceptional. We use it a lot in our meetings. It would be great for a situation where it's maybe a one-on-one conversation like the Burt Reynolds thing or a one-person show. Those are great because for people who just don't quite get it as far as the sound, they can read what's going on, and they can read it and watch at the same time.
What about audio description, my last question? Because these are all things that we talk about providing.
Audio description, I'm not sure what you're
So,
talking about.
audio description is when you have what's called an audio describer sit in the theater. It's mostly for theater. And they are trained on the script that's being performed, the show that's being performed, and they actually talk into the ear of the person who is And this is the opposite. This is
Yeah,
for
this
someone
is for
who's.
somebody who's
Yeah, I'm
blind.
sorry, I get
Yeah,
that, I'm sorry, that's vision impaired. We'll come over and do that
We
in
get
another one.
confused a lot,
Yeah.
but actually, they're way two separate
Yeah,
things.
way two separate things. But, well, I'll just continue to talk about it, is that they talk in, the audio describer talks into the person's ear, there's earbuds for that, and tells what's happening on the stage. It doesn't cut through the dialogue. They're trained to speak when there's quiet times on the stage, but they'll describe the costumes, they'll describe the stage setting, they'll describe, the facial expressions of the actors on what's going on stage. So we'll talk a little bit more of that. Sorry about that confusion. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you go into a museum and you have someone leading a group and you have individuals who are hard of hearing as part of that group.
We have set up tours before. Actually, we did one summer before last at the Florida Oceanographic Society, and we provided interpreters, and they walked us through. The people would describe what was going on, and the interpreter was just standing right there and interpreted for the whole thing. We had a group of about 40 deaf people that came to it. It's easier to set up something like that and say, we're going to offer it on this day, and interpreters will be provided, rather than say, providing an interpreter every time you turn around. It's easier to do it in a group, and most of the times, our deaf community, they're social animals. They like to get together as a group. So offering it through, my center or the deaf club or something like that is always a good thing.
So what are the rules when to advertise or to provide an interpreter for at the museum if there's a public tour?
Okay. As a place of public accommodation, under ADA, you have to provide effective communication. That requirement is that somebody with hearing loss, whether they're deaf or hard of hearing, has to be provided with an equivalent level of communication with somebody with full hearing. If a request is made, if a deaf individual comes to you and says, I want to tour your museum and I want you to provide me with an interpreter, you have a legal obligation to do that if that's their primary language. You're not going to get too much of that as far as hard of hearing individuals. Number one, hard of hearing individuals normally don't let you know that they're hard of hearing. That's only a last resort. And they don't ask for amplification. So I don't even think that's an issue. But you may have the occasional deaf person that wants to come and experience a museum, et cetera, and as such, even though you're nonprofit, it's best to do it if you can. It's not a cheap thing to do by any means. Interpreters run in the area of $50 to $100 an hour. 75 is pretty much the average, and you pay for 2 hours. That's why if you can arrange for a group, it's a whole lot more affordable on a per person
Right.
basis.
So I guess my question would be, and for the organizations here, is what's the appropriate timeline for a request to have bring in an interpreter?
You should be able to get an interpreter within 48 hours.
48 hours,
Yeah.
okay. So if I come in today and I want an interpreter at 11:30, what's the appropriate response? That's a difficult
I
thing.
would say, if it's not an emergency situation, can we reschedule and we will provide an interpreter?
Okay.
Because you call an interpreter agency and say, I need somebody here in an hour, that's an emergency situation, and I guarantee it's going to cost you $100 an hour. Then it becomes extremely expensive. You are not going to run into too many people in the deaf community that are not reasonable. They understand that there's a certain lag in requesting an interpreter and getting an interpreter. But you should be able to get one within 48 hours.
Right. So that's the point that I want for us to think about, is that the responsibility, I believe, for people with disabilities who need accommodations need to request them in a reasonable amount of time so that those accommodations can be met.
Yeah.
And that's a difficulty.
Particularly with this group, as opposed to, someone who's in a wheelchair, yes, you should expect that there's going to be a ramp or there's going to be a means to get to different levels.
Right. What, we talk a lot about how things are advertised on your website and in your promotional materials. So do you have any comments about how that's listed, how you see those requests for accommodations on websites of art organizations?
I think that simply a line that says accommodations will be provided upon request and leave it at that. And then they'll know, particularly if it's someone that needs an interpreter, understands they need to request that
Right.
interpreter.
And I would suggest that when you say within 48 hours prior to your visit, or give a specific amount of time that you need to line those people up. And that's a reasonable thing to put on your website and on your promotional materials. You also need to have, when you put your information on your website, have it in an easily found click on your website. Sometimes it takes forever to find an accommodation, so who do I call, or things like that. We'll talk about that in a little bit more.
One thing, when it comes to accommodations, if you ever need interpreters, we don't do interpreting services, but you can call my office at any time, and if it's on the weekend, it's on the answering machine, and it gives you a number to call an interpreting service that you can call through. So at any time, it could be a Sunday and you need to find an interpreter for Monday or Tuesday, just call my number, listen to the answering machine, and the answering machine will give you the number for the interpreting service in the area. Yes, ma'am?
You also have for Palm Beach County, we're located in northern Palm Beach County.
No, you would need to call the Deaf Service Center down there. There's a lot more interpreting services in Palm Beach County than there are here, simply because the population is probably 5 to 10 times bigger than it is here. So.
Any other questions for our esteemed panel? And sorry I picked at your brain too much, but
Yeah.
yes.
Sort of a question / idea that came up when I heard Marian speaking at the State of Florida Conference in Orlando a couple of months ago. I was sitting with Terry Garber, who's doing Artists for a Cause. And one of the things that Artists for a Cause has is school clubs. So at Southbrook High School, there's an Artists
Right.
for a Cause student club. The other thing that they have at Southbrook High School is they actually teach American Sign Language. And so I kind of turned to Terry and said, I wonder if there's an opportunity for collaboration to try to have some of the students learn about being an interpreter in real life situations as they're mastering the language as a perhaps less expensive alternative to the professional alternatives. Any thoughts on somehow trying to cobble something like that together?
Yes and no. And very honestly, interpreting there's a difference between a signer and an interpreter. And these are kids that are just rudimentary sign language, where, someone like Evelyn has been doing this for 15 plus years. There's a whole different level of competency in trying to relate the information to the deaf community, who all sign differently. And so the interpreter really has to learn how to read a deaf individual and their signing skills and adjust their skills to that level. So, yeah, there's probably something there, but I wouldn't push it too much, because it's just not going to accomplish what you would like it to accomplish.
I would just, go ahead.
Mhm.
Are we as a public, well, we're a nonprofit organization, what are we required to do as far as the deaf population?
You're required to provide effective communication. If it is a publicly accessed situation that anybody can come in off the street, then so can they, and you have to provide a means for them to communicate on the same basis as anybody else, okay, and receive the information.
It would be okay to say we can provide this within 48 hours?
Yeah, the law says that you have to provide it. It doesn't say you have to provide it on the spot.
I see.
But and there, like I said, most of the deaf community are very reasonable about this, that, they understand that it takes time to set up an interpreter. So,
But when you say most of them, and then you say the law.
well, there's always the militant one that walks in the door and says, I want it and I want it now. You probably should call me when that happens. Okay. But the law is, it's very clear. It's just the same law as wheelchair ramps and accessible parking and accessible bathrooms, except this accommodation is flesh and blood where the other ones are concrete and steel. Okay? But you still have to provide
However,
it.
when you said that the hearing amplification or something for them to listen to, that's enough?
If for somebody who's hard of hearing, an amplification device
But
is,
not enough for the deaf, right?
well, you can put all the amplification you want on them, and it's not going to work. So, there's different accommodations for each. If it's something that is a lot of verbal presentation, and it's a hard of hearing group coming in, you may want to provide CART in that situation instead of amplification. And
So if we
CART
had
is
that
the
written-
captioning.
Written, that would be adequate?
If it's real-time captioning that everybody can see, yes.
The other thing this really offers the art community is the opportunity to develop new partnerships. Because I think that this is something that has been, we've talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act, we've talked about it from the standpoint of accessibility, meaning doors and ramps and all of those kinds of things. But when it gets into the situation of deaf or hard of hearing, it's a whole different issue. And so it really gives you the opportunity to go down and meet with your
Yeah.
counterpart, who's probably nowhere near as good, but the opportunity to meet with his counter. Yeah, well, but Martin County, but in St. Lucie County, and you just really, it helps you, it's a whole new partnership opportunity with the disability community,
Yeah, I think
all the way
the
around.
point is that we're here.
Yeah.
You need to access us. If you get into a situation that you're not sure how to deal with, just pick up the
Call us.
phone and call us.
That's great.
And
Yeah.
we're available. And we do know the law in our specific areas.
Exactly.
And, you don't have to learn it. You don't have to relearn it. Just use us.
And that's the formula for success, is to make those partnerships and be willing to go out and ask for the assistance and clarification of what's going on. That really is what will move access along, is to do that.
Absolutely.
So I have come across, someone called me from a small art center in Dunedin, and they were giving an art class. And there had an instructor who, the instructor was instructing, but not where there was no, the question would be how the person who was taking the class was deaf. That person wanted to have an interpreter, but she wanted to bring in her own interpreter, and she didn't want to have to pay the class fee or any other fees that were associated with it for the interpreter. So what do you think happened? What would you suggest?
The interpreter shouldn't pay. The
Should.
interpreter is an accommodation. It's off to the side.
Right.
In that situation, the Department of Justice says you shouldn't use friends or relatives or whatever to interpret, but that's mainly in medical and legal type situations. When in this kind of situation, if the deaf person was willing to bring in someone with them to interpret, I'd welcome them in the door, and they shouldn't, that interpreter should not be charged, because the interpreter's there to work, not necessarily to gather information
Right.
from the class.
Right. And then just, I'm telling that story because things will pop up that you will never even dream of having this occur. So you have to be able to, you know, think it through and know what the law is, and also contact
Exactly.
your helpers here. Yes.
I have two very unrelated questions. Susie, I know Susie needs to leave shortly, but we didn't really talk about the autism spectrum, and that's something that HPS deals with. Are there any thoughts that you want to share on that in terms
Of accommodation?
conversation?
You know, each disability is different. When we're the program that we're running that is a transition to adulthood, and we do a variety of things. For us, I think that we always have a supervisor with us. We're always in small groups, and I think the key is for the person who's there to kind of know the issues, know the disabilities, et cetera. We certainly don't walk in and say, hey, we got a group of kids with autism with us, watch out. You know, we don't do that at all. But I think that that the biggest issue that we would probably have would be the fact that many people like to touch things. Like to feel, well, in many art galleries, you just don't do that, you know. So with us, it's more just being clear on where we're going, and then, you know, what the supervision is. Do you want to, please?
Yes, and what I would add also, each individual have their special trigger, and we provide more support. It will be a one-to-one situation where if the person become agitated or the sounds, because it could be anywhere and you will not see it, but they are affected. So we just provided, like, they can walk away and they can just a lower ratio. And if we know someone has difficulties, you know, outside, or, you know, we provided other alternative to make it pleasant for them and also not make it a, you know, an issue for everyone also.
But, you know, you saw the issue with the young woman with autism on the plane who they removed from the plane because she wanted a warm meal. I think if a parent or someone that's not related from a standpoint of an organization comes into an art gallery or a musical or something like that, that it can be very difficult, because if you go, let's say, to see Phantom of the Opera, my favorite, you go to see that, and all of a sudden the person next to you starts acting out, you know, they're interesting choices. So I think that dealing with people with autism and intellectual disabilities is a really difficult situation, because obviously they have every right and we want them there, but it can be an issue. And I think what France says is, I think in those kinds of cases, it's up to us to make sure that we know what we're getting into and what our favorite word, appropriate kind of opportunity is. So I think there's responsibility on the side of disability, as well as responsibility on the side of the art galleries and all of the different art venues. Is that a good enough answer? You know, because I think really it's difficult because you don't know the trigger sometimes. So.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. I have some examples of it.
Can I add one thing? And I had said that we're here to contact. If you're in Martin County and you have questions on your physical space, mm-hmm. and whether you are in compliance or there's something you need, Bob Steiner with General Services, yep. That's what he does for a living, and he will come in and actually review your whole place for you, walk mm-hmm. through it with you, and tell you what the law says versus what you've got, and if you are in compliance and if you're not. He's there. Use him as a resource. And
he's kind and non-threatening.
Yeah.
Because I think many people are terrified to call in an ADA specialist because they just see, now I'm going to have an elevator, now I'm going to have to do this, do that, etc. But I will tell you that he really comes in and kind of tells it like it is. But all the way from simple things.
And
Like,
if you're
yeah.
in the county, he will review your building plans and stuff like that. But if you're in the city of Stewart, they don't go in front of him. So if you're in the city, you specifically need to call him to
Right.
see if you're in compliance.
Right.
Your second question, yes?
Oh, the resource of everybody's meeting you guys today, we don't have anybody at the table that represents vision loss and blind, and I'm curious if you're more in the industry than we are, what are those resources that we would reach out to in a similar way that we can help you direct?
There really isn't much in the area. There was the 2200
Right.
group.
We kept trying to remember the name.
And they
Yeah.
basically folded. And of course, there was Braille International over in Jensen Beach, and they've folded. So there really isn't a strong group for the blind. There's the Lighthouse of the Blind South. There's State Blind Services, who are very helpful. But locally, I don't think there's any nonprofits.
We provide services to some folks who are visually impaired, as does the ARC and as does Goodwill. But I wouldn't say that we are experts. But if you had a question, we could get you to the right place. Because I think we generally know, but I think that for a specific question or somebody, a complaint, those kinds of things, we could certainly get you to the right place.
Do you, go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify something. The class that you were mentioning, because we have school, do we have to apply to provide an interpreter for a deaf student
For
at
what,
our cost?
what type of school is it? What is
Art.
it? Okay, it's an art school. Yes, would be the easy answer.
So we would be totally losing money on each class. If a
Okay.
class costs you $300 for an 8-week course, and we have to provide for 3 hours an interpreter per class at $225.
And I will tell you the same thing, I hear this from doctors all the time, saying that patient's costing me more than I'm making from that patient. The one person in the wheelchair is not who you charge the wheelchair ramp to. The one person who uses that handicap parking lot or that handicap bathroom, you don't charge that to them. You charge that over your whole patient base, over your whole student base. So you have to look at this as an accommodation just the same as that. It's not a one-on-one. This is an accommodation that you provide, and it has to be amortized over your whole student body that are collectively there. So it's a cost of doing business, simply as that.
And I would say that if it's provided graciously, that person will become a friend of yours and will tell the community about the good work, and it'll build good networking and good opportunities too. It's almost self-fulfilling in a way. So,
Are there any grants available for that type of thing?
I wish. I understand. I got to provide them all the time. I understand what the cost is, and I'm a little nonprofit, and I pay that. But there is no, there's no Medicare, anything like that doesn't pay for interpreters. There are no grants out there that you can apply for that will pay for an interpreter.
Personally, I think if the lawmakers are going to make a law like that, they should make some accommodation for the government to supply that to nonprofits.
Have you heard the 2 words, unfunded mandates?
Yeah.
We live in a world of unfunded mandates that require us to do more and more and more, and the funding stays static or less. I think that what you deal with is very difficult because accommodations for many other groups are more across the board than with someone who is
More
deaf.
architectural
So,
and stuff like that.
Capital improvement, wheelchair, right? Well, I just want to mention that the cabinet is going, not the cabinet, but the legislators are going into session now to do the final approval of the budget, and they're underfunding the museum and all the requests for the nonprofit museums and everything. So please write your congressman about that. Because
Right.
it's so important right now. June 1st, they're starting it, and we want them to fully fund the request for the museums. Otherwise, it's really going to cause some problems.
Right. And this past year, they fully funded because it was an election year, so.
Right.
So that's never going to happen again until we have another election, maybe, perhaps, but.
Yes, so please write your congressman.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest for some of your funding issues is to go within your organization and ask for special support just for those kinds of accommodations. And, you know, and that's what happens too, is that go back to your user base and look for helpers that way. And in Palm Beach County, there is a group called FLACA, Florida Accessibility Consortium, something like that. It works with Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County, and they do a lot of training on access within those counties. And I know the Kravis Center works a lot with them as well. And there's also in Palm Beach County, the VSA Palm Beach, who's through the Parks and Recreation Department. Cindy Pijanowski is that director. And she has a lot of resources, and she might be able to help you do that. And my other comment would be for local resources within the area. Does the school district have a vision impaired specialist for students? Some of the schools, but the
I would
district
suppose they
provides
do.
it. Or hearing specialists. They're like itinerant. In Miami-Dade, they're itinerant, and they go
They're
from school to
itinerant
school.
here too, in many cases.
Right.
Right.
That might be a resource to think about what the school district provides and who their contacts are for that. So the schools have to do it, so they're out there somewhere. Any other questions or comments? You guys have been terrific.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thank you very much.
And
It's good to see you guys.
I want to thank the interpreter, too.
Be in
Your hands
touch.
get tired after a while, right? Thank you.
We work very closely together.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and do some more work here. Okay, so again, the panel was terrific. Thank you, Nancy, for bringing them together with us and for sharing those local resources. That was wonderful. The next slide is really just showing that people with disability, there's a continuum of disability. And as our gentleman said, and I'm bad with names, so I'll just call him gentleman. That's my disability. I can never remember anybody's name. The population of people who are deaf is very small, but hearing loss is larger than that. And so this slide just shares with you the different kinds of disabilities and the continuum that we have. And notice that the elderly population is on the bottom, and we're growing. So statistically, the population is about, this slide says 12.9% has a disability. It's, school districts used to be about 15% of the students had a disability. I just want to, just that number's going to go up, the percent of the population, as the baby boomers become older and their disabilities become more prevalent. Numbers are small of people with disabilities on the whole. And you might want to say, well, why should I even bother if I put in these expenses? You know, it's not going to make a big difference on my bottom line. I'm not going to just make a lot of money, but because the number is small, but just remember that people don't come in by themselves. Like we started out this conversation, they'll be coming in with family or friends or coworkers. So you're building up a patronage of users. And that might be something, I don't know, for your executive director. You're the director? Are you the director of? Yeah, and you're the director, right? But so you would get it. You would understand that. But oftentimes in big facilities, in performing arts centers or art museums, the frontline staff gets the need to be more accessible. They see it, but the cost and everything has to be persuaded to the administrations and so forth, to the board. Yes. Yes. Right.
It is, but you have to, these are all things that are going to support that you're giving.
Right. I have up here some information from the Kennedy Center. They do a conference every year called Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability. I believe it's in Washington this coming year. And there are, they just talk to people all over the country and internationally come and talk about access issues and what's the current trends and stuff like that. You know, if you happen to be in Washington and want to go during the summertime, it's there. It's a little bit expensive to go to, but there are those resources there. And the Kennedy Center I have here on the table has a lot of resources available, a lot of information sheets and so forth, which we'll go over. And then the next slide just talks about the statistics for older Americans. They volunteer, they are veterans, and so forth. And they're active members of the community and should be active in your organization as well. So, as the gentleman said, no disability, there's all different levels of the disability. So we don't want to put things together just for one kind of disability for the deaf and hard of hearing. You want to have a continuum of services. But you need to communicate accessibility. Look at how your pictures, when you do your brochures, all of you here, include someone who uses a chair in some of your pictures. Include someone who, and it's sort of crass in a way to pick out disability to put on your brochure, but it shows that you're open. Many, many years ago, when the civil rights were strong, people always looked, and you might want to delete this from the tape, but they wanted an African American to be visible on their information, on their website, on their written material. It's the same thing for people with disabilities. People want to go where they see like people. They don't want to feel that they're just there alone. So work very hard to include someone with a visible disability, because autism is not visible, the hard of hearing isn't visible. Someone who uses a guide dog would be great to show on your website. Someone who uses a cane would be good to use, and someone who has mobility using a walker or uses a chair. It would just make it would open the door to people to know that you're accessible. But don't do it if you're not accessible. You have to be ready to accept that population to come in. So you want to communicate your accessibility. You want to use pictures. You want to use the accessible symbols, which is in your PowerPoint. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. You want to use your alternative formats for large print. We'll talk about some of that. People First Language is the appropriate way to talk about people with disabilities. We'll go over that in a few minutes. You need to have an access coordinator for your organization. If you get money from the state of Florida, you say who is your access coordinator, and you also fill out that you've had an access plan review, that you've done a 504 plan. I know that not everybody who says yes has actually done them. I know that the access coordinator probably doesn't know they're the access coordinator. but you have to have one. And it has to be someone who can answer questions and be on board for all the hours that you're open. So, which sometimes makes it difficult, but if someone comes in and has an issue or access question, you need to say, I can't help you right now, but let me get you in touch with my access coordinator. They'll be able to help you. That again shows good faith that you want to continue being welcoming. Your information needs to be accessible, your descriptions of your programs, as well as to have accessible programs. So all these things tell the public that that you're open and welcoming. So let's just talk a minute about what did I do when you entered this building, when you entered this room. What was that experience?
Climbing over the chairs,
Right. What did that say to you?
then I'm in the wrong place.
Okay. And
Right. I'm not supposed to be here.
Right.
You know, you're blocking my entrance.
right. But didn't we say, welcome, we're so glad you're here, come on in?
Okay, yes, yes. Now that I.
So it sort of was a contradiction of, we want you to come, you're here, yet I can't get in. I have difficulties getting in. So we have to work on that. We have to work on those kinds of things. There was a lady who works here. She was the one setting up all the technical stuff. She uses a cane. And we were talking about how her access issues might be. I'd asked her to see if she'd want to talk, but she didn't want to do it. She mentioned that when she went to the World Trade Center, she had to park so far away, and she had to walk so far. And then when she got into the area, she couldn't do it because there was too much walking. It was too hard for her. So it was accessible, but getting there and getting into the actual activity made it so she was just too tired. She had to turn around and come home, even after she paid her full admission. So it just has to be kept in mind that people will come into your facilities, and if they have difficulty parking or it's a long walk, if the ramp is in the back of the building, if it's just not easy to get in, they're going to come in with an attitude to begin with. You've lost them in some degree. So it's called wayfaring, about how you get there with your signage and your half the battle is getting into the building. At the Tampa Museum of Art, which is a beautiful new facility, parking is in a garage that you have to cross a railroad track, uncovered so if it's raining, there's no covered way to get in. And then you walk over a beautiful little outside area, and you come in, and then you have to go over to the ticket booth to get your ticket. People are crazed how difficult it is to do that. This was a brand new building. So they're just mad before they even start. They've lost donors. They've lost a lot of support because of that. And they really had no control over it because the parking is part of the city. And the city provided the parking, and the museum, there's no space for their own parking. So handicap accessible parking is in this garage that's way far away. It's just difficulty. So, and I've heard the complaints about that. So just keep that in mind as you are doing things. When you have an outdoor festival, parking is a concern. Your paths to get around the festival area, your wires that you may have on the floor that may be a hazard for people who are walking. Just all that has to be kept in mind. Just you have to really sort of think about how are people accessing, getting into where I want to go. Yes, ma'am.
parking for an outdoor event, if you get a permit from the city to do it, is it the permit holder's responsibility to secure parking for handicap, or is it a city responsibility? Do you know how that works?
It's probably your government agents, governmental, whether it's county or city, that would have to set it up. But you're going to bear the brunt of the criticism for it. So in the 504 plan, you're ultimately responsible for it because you should not host an event in a place that's not accessible. So you would end up being the one getting messed up. And if you have an outdoor event, you have to make sure you have accessible johns, porta potties. So just think about that as well. That's part of the consideration. You have to have, your path has to be unobstructed so a chair can get over things easily. They have those wire covers, those plastic things that go over wires on the ground, and just things like that. It's not all that easy to do, but it's important to do that. Someone using a stroller would have the same thing, a mom pushing a child. So some accessible event ideas. We touch tours, backstage tours. This is a lot for performing arts centers. Audio description I talked about briefly. Shadow interpretations, sensory-friendly events like for students, individuals on the autism spectrum. Sensory-friendly events are big things now for theaters. They will host, in Tampa, they have Sunshine Sundays. They will host the show they'll host, they'll open up the museum early, and so families with children on the spectrum will be able to come in early and have a quieter time with visiting. There won't be quite as many people around, which is important. Sensory-friendly events will have a quiet room. Individuals on the spectrum often need a place to calm down if something set them off. They'll have a quiet room set up for that. And those are things that you would need to make sure that if you were a larger institution, that your whole staff knows what's going on there, and what accommodations need to be made for individual different kinds of disabilities. So we're going to talk some about guest services interactions. We want you to be welcoming to people, to be helpful, to be accessible, and provide quality services. Well, it's the same that you would do to anybody who comes to visit your organization. So some of this just makes common sense, but you want to see the person with a disability as a person, not that there's a disability. We don't go around, this is part of People First language, we don't go around saying, Olivia, you red-haired Olivia, you can't come in because you have red hair, or I don't like the color of your shoes, or whatever. You don't do that. So the people with disabilities just need to be accepted just like anybody else. Having a disability is just part of who that person is. It doesn't define that person. You need to relax around people with disabilities, different disabilities. You're not going to be in trouble if you say something wrong or if you mess up doing something. Because if you are welcoming and do your very best to provide good service, they're going to just think that's great. And they will help, individuals with disabilities will help you make changes that would help them. They'll be engaged if your attitude is such that we're glad that you're here. And this goes back to you as the administrator, as well as to any staff persons you might have or any volunteers you might have for some of your events. So you need to listen to the guests, just like you would do anybody else. If they have a complaint or have a concern, talk to them about it. Ask them for their advice. What would have been done, what could we have done better to help you, to make your visit more enjoyable? Talk to the person, eye-to-eye contact. If someone is using a chair, you might want to get down to their level to talk to them. Sit down in a chair and have a conversation with them. Because someone who uses a wheelchair a lot will often have neck problems. And for them to look up like that at you all the time is difficult on them. It'll hurt, it'll start to bother them after a while. If someone is hearing impaired, talk directly to that person who is hearing impaired. And they're using an interpreter, don't talk to the interpreter. Talk to the person who's asking the question. That's who you want to converse with. Sort of like, in a way, the women's liberation movement, women's movement. When we used to go out and buy cars or something that was more like man stuff, they'd always talk to the guy when they would talk about price or talk about what's in the car and so forth like that. It's my money. It's my car. Talk to me or I'm not purchasing the car from you. It's that same kind of attitude with people with disabilities. Talk to them directly. Don't talk down to a person with a disability. You don't want to say, oh, we're so glad you're here. It's just so wonderful that you came out here to do that. You don't want to talk down to the person. They just want to be able, as I say, sit at the table just like anybody else. It's not so special. It's good that you're here, but it's good that everybody's here. Don't say, geez, your difficulties getting here, I'm just so glad you're here. Don't go there. A service animal, when you have one in your facility, is a working animal. They're not to be petted. They're not to be, oohed and awed over, things like that. They belong to the person who uses them. It's an extension of that person, and they are working. So let's talk a little bit about what is the policy for using service animals. What's the requirements? Anybody want to guess? You have to let them in. You have to let them in. There's no papers that say this is my service animal. There's no registration that's required. They don't have to have a little jacket on the animal that says I'm a working dog or a service dog. That person comes into your facility with a dog and they say, this is my service animal. You have to let that person in and the animal. That animal, the service animal, the service dog now, because they've changed the law, has to be under good behavior. It has to not disturb your other guests. So if it's barking or running around or growling or whatever, first of all, that's probably not a real service animal. And second of all, that person who is using the animal doesn't have it under control. So you can ask that person to leave if they're disturbing the everyday routines of your facility. Used to be until 2011 or 2012 when it was finally implemented that anybody could bring in anything and say it's my service animal. They brought in birds, they brought in cats, there were snakes. The Cummer Museum of Art had a pony brought in, and little ponies are still accepted as a service animal. So imagine in the art museum at the Cummer that they had to let the animal in. Well, the funny story with that is Hope McMath, the director of the museum now, she was education director at the time, had told all her docents, her education staff, that they were having this big event and they were going to have the service animals come in. She neglected to tell her facilities people that the animal was coming in and there was a big to-do about it. So we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but whatever you decide as what your rules and regulations are for your facility. You have to make sure that your whole staff, anybody who works with you or volunteers, knows what the policies are. So if you see someone come up to you and they're bringing their bird or a cat or something, you don't have to let that person in with that animal. But you need to think about your relationship with the community and that person. And if you turn that person away, what's the downside of doing that? Again, if that animal misbehaves, you can ask them to leave. So a lot of the bigger organizations might let that person in with a cat. They're saying it's a service animal. By law, they don't have to, but just the ramifications of turning that person aside would be, difficult for them. And some people will push to sue. I hate to say it like that, but a lot of this access stuff, some people see that as a quick way to make money. So my goal in talking to everybody is to prepare you so you don't get sued. I don't want to see wasted dollars on legal stuff. If someone is vision impaired, offer your hand. If you like to shake hands with people, offer your hand to shake. And you could say, I've got my hand extended to you. That's okay to say that. If it's a person who has lost their right hand, they'll shake your hands with their left hand. They know they have that disability. You don't have to feel uncomfortable by offering your hand. You can still do that. So any common courtesies that you might extend, continue to do that with that person with a disability. Any questions about service animals and any of this? Shaking your head like, what? I can't believe I got to do it. Yeah, okay.
Ponies, I know. Next thing you know.
It's okay to ask people, what assistance do you need? And offer the assistance, but don't push it on people. There's a great story of a gentleman in, I was at a big conference in a southern state, and there was it was a steep ramp going to where the big meeting was going to be held. And I was traveling with an artist who was this old-fashioned southern gentleman, and he wanted to get up and push that wheelchair for someone coming in there. And I said, you can't do that. Well, first of all, the wheelchair is an extension of that person. You can never grab that wheelchair. I said, you have to ask, can I help you? And if they say, no, I'm okay right now, say, that's great. And you can walk behind that person. You can stay to the side and say, I'm here if you need any assistance. Offer it, but don't give it to them unless they ask for it. If you're walking around your facility with someone who walks slow, walk slow. If you are talking to somebody or giving an explanation of a piece of artwork, like as a docent, don't talk about that piece that you're going to see or go up to visit, to look at, until everybody is there with you or the person who's walking slow gets there. So everybody gets the same information at the same time. When you're talking to individuals, talk to them with your face to those who are talking. I know as when you're looking at artwork and talking about it, you tend to turn your head and talk to the picture, and explain the picture. Try real hard to have that conversation with the person face to face. Don't turn your back on them as you're talking. It's just like giving a talk. That's why we have our notes here and stuff up here. You don't want to just be reading off the stage, off the screen like that. In your facilities, and I've been to Art Mundo before, and I'm not sure about the Lighthouse. If you have a big space to walk through, try and have some seating available somewhere in the gallery. And ideally, that seat should have arms on it, so someone who has difficulty getting up can use that for stability to push themselves up. A lot of times in many of the big art museums, they'll have these wonderful, fancy seats to sit down on, these modern stuff. And there's no arms, so that person, it doesn't really help that person. And have it strategically placed around if there's like a picture or an area that gets a lot of attention. Put your seat there so people can sit and still enjoy it. I know I like to do that after a while. I get tired of standing, I want to sit down. Oh, I forgot this one didn't come in. So my general tips would be, may I assist you? Follow up by asking, how may I assist you? Don't take offense if assistance is refused, and treat the patron with dignity, respect, and courtesy. So then we talk about people first language. Might not be in your brochure, but I have it in my box. I have handouts on this people first language, and you can order more of them if you want to hand out. It just talks about using, speaking about a person with a disability. It's called people first. Don't say the person's handicapped, he's mentally retarded, or he's got a birth defect. All these terms have changed throughout time to do that. It's sort of interesting sometimes because we learn about people first language. Reporters don't use it, TV news people don't use it because it adds a lot of extra words as they're talking, but it's really the appropriate thing to do. So you put the person first. You do not focus on the disability unless it's crucial to the story. When you're talking, avoid tear-jerking human interest stories. Oh, this quadriplegic was able to master this event. That's nice, but that's not what the story should be about. Do not portray successful people with disabilities as superhuman, and don't sensationalize.
Marian,
Yes.
it was interesting. This came up not too long ago. We have a women's donor circle called Women Supporting the Arts, and they contribute their own money to the circle, and then they collectively decide how to spend that money in the community. And there was a local organization who's they present some music concerts. They typically use the library space, so it's all very physically accessible. But some of the women were very put off by the fact that it was presented that a blind pianist was going to be playing versus a pianist who happened to be blind. And, coached me on the fact that the grant letter needs to say you need to look at this kind of language, so it's a perfect case in point of it's not all that crazy to think that he couldn't play piano just because he was blind, but it shouldn't come first.
Right. No. It could be in the bio,
Sure.
but that shouldn't be what the story's about, that you're having a famous pianist come in to entertain. It's hard, because you might think, well, he's blind, so maybe more people will come. But if you advertise that you might have for vision impaired people, that you have large print material, that would help bring in that audience. So you can advertise that fact with some of your collateral material, but I would be upset too, to say it that way. So we talk about don't use emotional descriptions as unfortunate and pitiful. We want to emphasize the abilities, just like you talked about, that here's an excellent pianist that we want you to see, to hear. Don't use condescending euphemisms. Show people with disabilities as active members of society. That's why I want you all in your print material and on your website to have people with disabilities visible as participants in your activities. Seems like just common sense, but most people don't do that. I've had a long-going battle with our Performing Arts Center to do that. It's just like, you just can do it. There's no real reason not to do it. And just remember, inclusion means all, to sit at the table just like anyone else. VSA, that's really our mantra, was to just be able to sit at the table. We don't want to win that medal. We don't like in Special Olympics, which gives you a medal for crossing over. We just want to be able to participate. That's all that there is. And if you need to raise the table a little bit so my wheelchair can get under it, please do that. But I just want to be able to take the class just like anybody else. So we have different symbols here. You can download those symbols, and I have a sheet up here you'll take online. You can use them as appropriate. Don't use the symbol if you're not offering that, if your facility is not really set up very well for people who are vision impaired. Don't use the vision impaired. Don't use the symbol with the cane. Same with wheelchair accessibility. Only use those symbols that are appropriate for you. For wheelchairs, it says, remember that a ramped entrance is not completely accessible if there are no curb cuts. And an elevator is not accessible if it can only be reached via steps. So it's not just the fact that you have the elevator, but you have to be able to get to it. If you have an elevator and you're in buildings and you put a table with flowers in front of the buttons to push the buttons for the elevator, someone using a chair has difficulty. Someone who's vision impaired, will have trouble finding those buttons. A lot of times they'll put the garbage can right in front of it and stuff. I was at someplace yesterday, and they had this nice, beautiful art piece right in front of the button or something. I said, shouldn't do that. So just try and see. I talk about when you're making changes to your facility or planning a new program, have people with disabilities be part of your planning committee. Have these people here today do a walkthrough. Have someone, have a community committee. And that's something, Nancy, that you might really be able to put together as an art accessible committee, and let them tell you what their needs are, because they'll clearly talk about what it is. I can't tell you everything because I don't happen to have that disability. I know I'd like larger print for things. So that I know, and I'll ask for that. But that's something I think the Arts Council can help provide, is that group of people to meet. When there's a new facility being brought in, have that committee go over and tour and make suggestions. It's easy to do, and then again, you'll have more you'll have more support for it. Description I talked about, and yes, it's for blind individuals with low vision, not for hearing. But that's something that they do at the Kravis Center. They have that ability to do that in some of the major theaters. In VSA, we have microphones and we have training material that can be used if there was ever a need to do that kind of training. People who are audio describers, it's not someone who's a flowery writer. It has to be someone who uses precise language to portray what's going on stage. It's really pretty neat if you've never used it. I sometimes use it just when I go to meetings just to see, because they'll describe things that you might not even notice on stage. The same thing for visual description. If you have a visual description done correctly, they'll point out things that you just won't notice about it. The visual description is not the history of the piece or, sociological implications. It's really what the piece looks like. It's this size, it's got this color, it's configured in such and such a way, and it's really interesting to listen to something like that. The TTY symbol, the one on the bottom, it's still a requirement by law to have that available. I don't know how many people use it now. They have a lot of they have a lot of telephones that show the person the interpreter on the screen that they do it. It's rather, the TTY, I think it might be coming passé. There are groups in the state that offer this material and information about it, and it's called FAST, Florida Association of something Technology. I don't remember what the S stands for, but they can help you find out what material is, what equipment's available. So that's something for you to check out in the laws, what if the TTY is still required. I truthfully don't know for sure. Volume control on your phones. You have handsets that help a person who is hard of hearing go through your area. Assisted listening systems and your sign language interpretation. You can put, you have a sign, that sign language sign on your materials, on your website. You also need to make sure that you can say interpreters are available for the third Thursday of every month between 10 and 2. You can say something like that, that you have that. So only put that symbol down if you're actually offering a program like that.
And you could, again, like Rick was saying, say with 48 hours notice.
Right. Just be clear what your requirements are, and that goes into policies and procedures, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Large print is wonderful. It's easy to do. Just you take out all the pictures from your text and just enlarge it to 18 point. It needs to be sans serif. Can't have all the curlicues like script and all that stuff. It needs to be sans serif. It needs to have a good contrast. Blue on yellow, black on white. Those are the kinds of things. It needs to be able to be seen.
I have a question. So for instance, when you're identifying the work of art, you recommended this 18 point.
If possible. And I have some information up here about, you probably do that. Yeah. I have a handout here for exhibitions to become accessible and how to hang it at a certain eye level and things like that. So I think you need to be able to, it's the midpoint of the middle of the picture needs to be at the midpoint of your chest. So someone who uses a chair will still be able to see it. There's a range of sizes, of heights.
We usually put 60 inches on center.
Yeah.
It's a little high.
Yeah. Well, you might want to sit in a chair and see if you can read the sign and look at the picture.
Thank you.
In the major museums, then they have all their people hanging the artwork and doing fancy labels and stuff like that. They don't like it when you tell them it should really be black and white in the 18 point because that makes it seem. They like to merge the labels in the background of the color of the wall and stuff. It just doesn't always work so well. Information symbol. You should have one of these at your desk where you come in when someone comes into your facility, that people can ask questions there. When you walk into your offices and is there a counter that people go to sell tickets or to talk to you about? Is there?
Yeah,
You have it.
information.
Right. The counter should have a lower level. It shouldn't be all like at a bar stool height or something like that. It needs to have a lower level so a child can ask you a question. You can see that child, or someone who uses a chair can ask you questions or be seen. So, try and have a counter with different levels on it. Sometimes people will have a little card table up or a little narrow table aside their other counter. It's okay to do that. It's not ideal, but it's okay. A lot of times people will have, if you go to hotels, they'll have different levels of their check-in desks, but then they'll have pretty flowers on the lower level, to make it decorative. And that defeats the purpose of having that two different levels. So, talk about closed captioning and open captioning. The closed captioning are subtitles that are set to come through. You'll see it on movies sometimes, and you switch to other languages and things like that. Open captioning is where people are capturing what is being said right then and there. I personally think that for an opera, you can capture the words, and if you're hard of hearing, you can see the words on stage set up correctly, and you can also, it's acceptable to have the script of what's being sung, the words being sung to pass out to people if they can't really hear the music, and this way they get to follow along and say next song or whatever it is on that. That's an okay thing too. Not many people will do that because it takes an extra step to do that. And again, you might not think there are people hard of hearing coming to the opera, but there are. There are. And the induction loops and all the loops the gentleman talked about, each building has its own concerns, depending on how it's set up with everything else. So your facilities are not, part of that, but they should have a sound specialist come in and talk about ahead of time what would be the best kind of hearing device to use for that. Braille is really, I forget what the number is for people who are using Braille. It's not as much as you might think anymore. There's the Division of Blind Services in Tallahassee. If you want to turn in, if you have a brochure that's used all the time for your everyday, information, you might want to talk to them about turning having one or two copies of your standard material, one in large print and one in Braille. And you can, schools might be able to do that, your school district might be able to, just to show that you're really accessible. If you're having a big community meeting, a conference of some sort, you put on your invitation, if you need an accommodation, please request it in 24 hours or 48 hours ahead of time. It also would be nice, especially for county, for big meetings like that, to have an interpreter there available. You notice it now, the governor has one when the state, the talks or the emergency management will have an interpreter there for you. The sensory-friendly, the little umbrella, is for autism, people on the autism spectrum. And that's a new symbol that's just becoming apparent, being used. So, and only use that when you've set up a special sensory-free program or you have that quiet room. There's a whole bunch of information that you should have in order to really use that symbol. In the Miami-Dade Cultural Affairs Office, Francine Anderson, she's done a tremendous amount of work on that, and she has a packet of information, which I have some to share with you about setting up programs for that. In the Cultural Affairs, they do an exceptional job of preparing our organizations to work with students on the autism spectrum, individuals, because she has a child that's on the spectrum. So if they see it, people will come. That's what we've been talking about. Expanding, let's see, do we have any questions about this? We're going to talk about marketing now. My suggestion would be, if you're going to start a program, you want a specific group of individuals with a special kind of disability to come in, I would start working on just one of the programs. If you want to have an interpreter come in, if you want to work with Rick and his program, set aside that time to work on a specific program for them, and let them help you define it and say what it's supposed to be. It's a famous story. The Museum of Modern Art was going to start a program for individuals who are hard of hearing, and they had provided an interpreter for a docent tour, and then they provided food after the tour to make it more of a social event, and food always works well when you want a lot of people to come. And they had it in a pretty room in the museum, and they had the cocktail tables, and they had the buffet line and things like that. And the lights were nice and dim, and it was a nice atmosphere. Well, Somebody who uses their hands to sign can't walk through the buffet line holding their plate. If the lighting is poor, they can't see the other people talking or see the interpreter going by. So their intentions were really great, but they sort of missed the boat because they set up the room totally differently than it needed to be. But now they have one of the most successful programs in a museum around. They have the lead tour person is actually the interpreter for these groups, and they have a docent, an English-speaking docent, as a sidebar to that. So it's trial and error as to what works. So if you're doing something to bring in people who are hearing impaired, specifically or vision impaired, do your marketing specifically for that. Work with the organizations in the community to help you promote it. Get on their calendar, go to their special events, be seen in the community as being interested in having those individuals attend your meetings, attend your event. So we have public marketing materials and symbols. You advertise your programs and alternative formats. YouTube videos are really pretty good for that. And I think I've lost my place. Oh, no. Accessible communications, we talked about that. JAWS Reader is what's on a website that people can, or an email. So if someone who's vision impaired uses a JAWS Reader, and it'll explain, it'll read out word for word what's there. There's specific rules for using a JAWS Reader and setting it up. People who go to the LEAD conference will get some specific guidelines for it. And in your packet, I have some background information on the JAWS Reader, what to do and how to set up your website to be accessible. It's in your packet of information. Everything that you set up for your customers and employees, you should look to make sure that it's in an accessible format. So if there's an emergency and you need what to do in an emergency, or for your emails and your telephones, you may not charge extra for materials to translate into accessible formats. You can't charge for that, to do that. Again, making your website accessible. There's going to be some things that you can't make accessible. They talk about house plans or floor plans of museums that you change your pattern of flow through when you go into different exhibit areas. Explain that you can't make it. You can't read it with JAWS, or you can't really put it correctly on your website that way. So if you talk to the person that say, now our floor plan is such and such, you come in, the exhibits will flow from right to left. Talk to the person who needs that specific information. And again, you can't charge for, oh boy, this is really out of order. All right. You can't charge for making things accessible. So the 504 plan, I talked about that. That's a questionnaire looking at your program and making sure that things are accessible. Again, if you get the Florida State Vision and Cultural Affairs grants, you have to say that you've done a 504 plan. I was put down in points because my 504 plan was not quite up to date. So that's like, whoa, you're kidding me. But you need to make sure that it's up to date. And there are plans available. You can go on the VSA website. Ours is a pretty easy plan. The National Endowment for the Arts has a very lengthy plan to go through, and it looks at all aspects of your organization to see what the access is. It's not used to penalize, it's used as an information piece to help you see where you need to add more accessibility. And again, that's where the access checklists are. So after you do the checklist, you need to put into your policies and procedures for your organization. Now, for your small organization, do you have a policies and procedures book?
Yes.
Okay. And Lighthouse, do you have one?
Yes.
Okay. So in that, and this is where your board might want to come in, you need to talk about your policies and procedures for people with disabilities and what they want you to do and what you can't do. Some places will say you can't touch anybody. So if that's the case, you can't push a wheelchair for them. So it just needs to be codified that this is what the rules and regulations are for your organization. And when you put that information in, you need to make sure all the people who are working or volunteering for your organization know what your rules and regulations are. So for bigger organizations with large staff turnover, you need to have orientation on your policies and procedures on working with people with disabilities frequently. You need to, if you have your cleaning crew that comes in, they need to know that they can't place the garbage can in such a place that prohibits people from pushing buttons or getting in or seeing things. So all that needs to be done. I know a lot of museums have their guards guarding the pieces. Well, they need to be trained as well. People who do parking for your organization, if you had valet parking for something, they need to know that someone who has a vehicle where their chair is their driver's seat and they have a drop-down ramp, they need to be able to park in certain places. They can't park on a hill or where there's an angle for parking and things like that. All those kinds of things. So it's not just you and your staff, but people who help people get into your organization need to know what the policies are for working with people with disabilities. Because again, as I mentioned before, if people are angry before they get into your door, they're not going to be very good visitors. So we want to take care of some of that ahead of time. So we talk about training, we talk about new staff. Your ADA coordinator needs to have some good training. For you up here, you might ask people from FLACA, that organization I talked about, to come in and do some additional training for your staff. VSA can certainly come in and do it, but it needs to be, and using this taping might be able to be used to be edited to use as part of your training. But training should be ongoing. They need to be familiar with what the rules are, and that's your ADA coordinator. So, and that ADA coordinator needs to know they are the ADA coordinator. A lot of times their names will be put on their list and they have no clue. So they need to do that. And then I talk about the committee members, and that's Nancy, having that group of individuals who have different disabilities be part of the arts accessible community panel or whatever you want to call it. It would be helpful to everybody. Just like I thought these people today were phenomenal in what they shared with everybody. So accessible art exhibitions, you need to hang the artwork. It talks about labels and lighting and contrast, circulation, route. When you set up your artwork, it's ideal, a wheelchair definitely has to be able to get through the exhibition area. Ideally, it should be the wheelchair plus another individual. Because when you're going through things, you're talking to your friend that you're with. So if it's too narrow and the person with a chair and their friend can't continue to talk, that's not as good. The exhibition content needs to be at a level where people who use a chair can view it. The labels need to be set as such. Equipment controls and interactive exhibits need to be clean, they need to be workable, they need to have information about how to use them, how to access them, your exhibition materials, and your disability symbols. Yes?
The addition of Braille, is that on something on the wall?
You don't have to do it on the wall for every exhibit that you put in. For that, I would have large print. If you have your labels, I would make a booklet out of them and maybe enlarge them and then just have it available for people to hand out.
When you say enlarge, then how large? You say 24 points? Okay, so you said print should be a minimum of 24 points, or they said 18 points.
Well, on what? On the labels?
Yeah, it says 24 points here.
Well, that was what those rules were. I believe it still can be 18 points.
But in the booklet, like if we made a booklet to go along with it, what size would you say?
I'd make it as big as you can make it. That still fits on the page, okay? If a 24-point gets your information across, I'd keep it that way.
Okay.
You want to make sure that your interactive stuff, say like in science museums and so forth, they have all the dials to turn. You need to make sure that they're in working condition and that they're clean because people are touching them all the time. Performing arts centers, there's information up here about that. How is Lyric Theater here?
I know they've got seating available up front, but I don't really know what else they offer in terms of.
Seats need to be available at all price point levels. I'm going to start coughing and then I'm going to be done. There's a lot of issues with marketing using excuse me, Ticketmaster and them not knowing the policies of the organization for selling tickets and stuff like that. A lot of suits are done because of that they can't, there's not enough information available about their accessible seating. Oh, I apologize, this cough's going to. So again, your policies need to be organizational policies, your building, your employment, and your communication. All those should be part of your policies and procedures about how you're including people with disabilities, how, and there's information here from the Kennedy Center about policies and procedures for these different areas. So I wouldn't profess to say exactly what to say and then just take this information and do your research on what should be appropriate. And again, that's really a board decision, your management of what you want to say and how you want to say it. So if you hire somebody to do some work for you, they need to be aware of your policies and procedures in your subcontract. You have to have your complaint procedures and your policies and procedures too, just as you would for anything. What's the job of the accessibility coordinator? And you need your alternate formats available for your information. Some information in the PowerPoint about the use of a service animal and the support people that come in. There is the building policies, which sounds like you've got a great person here in the community to help you understand what those are. It says signage in inaccessible entrances directing people to where the accessible entrances are. Try not to make the accessible entrance in the back of the building. Or going through the kitchen, I've seen going through the kitchen or the workspace to get into the main exhibit area. That's not good. But it could be changed. Your maintenance training and how to keep things clean and keep things from blocking entrances, blocking in the bathrooms. It was very interesting. did a workshop at the Harn Museum in Gainesville. And I had a lady who uses a chair, and she was also blind. And she loves going to art stuff. And she said her biggest issue was the bathroom. So think about that. What kind of issues might there be in a bathroom for someone who uses a chair and someone who's blind?
Doors?
Doors. First of all, where is the accessible bathroom? It may be the family bathroom. Need some signage to identify that that's the accessible bathroom, if that's what it is. What else?
Turning on the water. I have trouble in a lot of public places figuring out how the water works.
Absolutely. You don't know if you stick your hand in,
Right.
you have to turn it on. I mean, it's ridiculous. You just, no. Same with soap. What else would be of an issue? And it's really, like you say, for just all of us. But it's particularly for people who use a chair or are vision impaired. Is it a self-flush? Do you push a button? Do you pull a cord? How does that work? Where are the towels? Do you stick your hand in the machine, or do you pull towels? And if you're pulling towels, make sure the garbage can isn't blocking the towel holder. I never would have thought about issues in a bathroom like that. So how would you address that? How would you come in and they ask, I need to know where the accessible bathroom is. What would you say? Just down the hall, to your left or to your right?
You'd show them.
You could show them, but you don't want to go in there with them. You can't do that. That invades their privacy. So you might want to think about saying that it's an automatic flush, soap, you stick your hand, those questions that we just talked about, what it is to operate that bathroom successfully.
Well, that'd be good for everybody.
It would help me a lot when I'm trying to figure that out, too. Some people would put it on a handout, but someone who's vision impaired can't do that. And then if you're going to offer that information, that means everybody who would answer those questions needs to know that information. It's not A, B, C. Sometimes it's A, F, G, and all the way around to get some of this stuff done. Nationally, bathrooms all operate differently, so it's just sort of interesting. There's information on the ADA, a lot of people, technical stuff. Public spaces in the ADA, accessibility standards, removal of barriers. One thing that the gentleman, Rick is his name, right, who talked about effective communication. The term is effective. What is really effective? What is a good way of, an alternative way of communicating the same information? It has to be effective. It has to be usable. It has to be such that it doesn't insult the person who is taking down that information, that's using it. And I bring that to bear because the Kennedy Center, which is, I keep talking about them, but they are the ones to ask questions about, was this an effective communication? Was this allowable to provide this in an alternative fashion? So that's just, I think that you have to look into that into your policies and procedures as well. Employment, you should not discriminate when you're hiring someone to work who might have a disability. You can't ask, do you have a disability? You can say, are any accommodations needed for you? But if you ask that, you have to ask that to anybody who you're hiring or bringing in. We talked about availability of accommodations. That goes back to the bathroom issue as well. So every job description should have something about access in it. What's their position in working with people with disabilities in there? It could be that you're maintenance person, you know, in the job description, you will be able to talk with people with disabilities, and that might just be, if you have a question, let me help you, guide you to Joan, who could answer that question for you. Just as simple as that, as a common courtesy. A bunch of hiring policies, and for you, it's, you know, it's your small organizations, it's not as critical. It's critical, but you don't have to deal with it as much, just as long as you're open to all different kinds of people. They say that people with disabilities who are workers or are hired are some of the best employees you ever have because they're very dedicated, they do a good job, they just make excellent employees. If you do staff training, when you do it, keep a record of it. Pathways accessible, going in and out of a building, be accessible. And, you know, I've been doing this work for quite a while. I cannot go into a restaurant now without seeing things. You go into these restaurants and the bathrooms are so dark, it's so intimate in there. You can't see anything. You go to hotel rooms nowadays, the lighting is so poor. You can't see anything. They're just dark. You have to ask. I ask for extra lights because I like to be able to see where I'm going, you know, and stuff. So it's just all those kinds of things. What would make you happy if you went into a place? What would you need to be more comfortable? So it goes into all the training for the maintenance and the art staff and your ushers and ticket takers, people who park cars, things like that. Training policies, we won't go through that too much, but it's in your packet if you want to read it. Communications, make sure you use people first language. Have your access coordinator visible on your website. Visit Florida does not do a very good job of making their stuff accessible, to finding what programs are accessible. We've, in the past, tried to work with them to be more proactive in that area. But if you have programs that are accessible, make sure everybody around knows that they're accessible. Make sure Nancy knows that you've got programs going so she can help promote you. Have your symbols there that you use, your policies available if people want to see what your policies are. When you advertise, make sure you include your advertising for people who, for vision impaired, that you have something verbal to have for advertising. For someone who's hearing impaired, have the alternate available for them. The JAWS reader is a good thing to have your website looked at to see if it's available. Used to be a Bobby Ready accessible a program that would look at websites to see if they're accessible.
What did you say? I didn't understand that.
Bobby Ready?
There was someone who would look at them to see.
Right. There are programs out there that will look at your website to see what the access issues are.
And do you know the name of them? What kind of programs do you mean? Something that's web accessible? Or?
Yeah, let me see if it might be in your packet. If not, I have some information here on the type of program for that. On your website. So everywhere that you market, make sure that your information's accessible. Tell your board members and your patrons that you're working on these programs. You want to make sure your media people know about it, and to your community. It's good to use the statistics about your population that you're working with, and personal stories and photographs. But when you tell personal stories, it's not the story that the sobbing, oh, woe is me that I was able to do that. It's a personal story with a picture of someone in a wheelchair saying how much fun they had going through the museum. It could be a mom saying, my child who is on the spectrum had a great time going to see the show. It's those kinds of personal stories that will help sell your organization as being friendly and opening to all to different people. Again, the photographs and meet and greet your people that you are working with. Your public marketing materials. Make sure your symbols are there. Those symbols are free to use. You can download them, but again, only use them, put them on your site if you are offering those kinds of programs that are accessible. In your policies and procedures, if you need to provide an interpreter, you have to have a comment that says accommodations will be provided when requested within 72 hours or 40 hours, whatever your board decides that you want to be able to provide. And put that on your website and who to contact for those, for that information. Don't do the work and not advertise it, and then you really won't get any return on investment. And I think we had this before. At what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So that should be our mantra, is how you make people feel. All right? We done? Cut.
Thank you.
Thank you.